Hello, this is Brian Oughton of Apologetics315. Today's interview is with Dr. Paul Moser. Paul is professor and chair of philosophy at Loyola University Chicago. He is also the author of many works in epistemology and the philosophy of religion, such as The Evidence for God, The Elusive God, Divine Hiddenness, Knowledge and Evidence, among many others. The purpose of this interview is to explore the issues of epistemology, evidence, and the hiddenness of God. Well, thanks for taking the time to do this interview, Paul.
Thanks, Brian. My pleasure.
Well, I must say that although I haven't read all of your books, from what I have read, I feel some of your views really resonate with me, so I'm really excited about speaking with you today. Before we get started, could you tell our listeners a bit more about yourself and what your main interests are?
I teach in the philosophy department at Loyola University of Chicago, where I'm also a chairperson. And my main research interests are in the theory of knowledge and in the philosophy of religion, particularly in the area of religious knowledge, even more specifically, knowledge of God. And in my recent writings, I've been focusing on the various theories of knowledge of God and the most durable account of evidence for God, in particular, evidence for God that involves knowing God.
I'm curious what got you interested in the area of philosophy, and in particular, why focus on epistemology?
I've had an intense interest in the area since I was about 15 years old, because that's when I became a Christian, and the first question was, what kind of evidence do I have or don't have for this commitment called Christian belief in God? So the interest started young and led to explorations in philosophy as a means to illuminating the religious experience that was the foundation for my belief in God.
Now, in regards to how epistemology relates to the work of Christian apologetics, do you think that it holds a special importance in any way?
Indeed, because if we are going to give an explanation of our Christian commitment that offers a defense of some sort, we need to attend to relevant evidence. But epistemology is, of course, the theory of knowledge, and the theory of knowledge includes the theory of evidence or justified belief. So if you're going to have an interest in apologetics, you must attend to epistemology, or the theory of knowledge.
Well, I suppose the whole question of does God exist and how do we know He exists entails epistemology, and you can't help but get into it immediately then, huh?
Well, I would say that if you are reflective on your Christian belief, you will have to take up questions of epistemology. I would say at the same time that many Christians do not pursue the self-reflective questions, and that doesn't undermine their faith commitment or even their evidence. They can still have the needed supporting evidence and still have vibrant faith, but they will be at a deficiency when the self-reflective questions come up, such as, is your evidence durable? Is your commitment in God able to sustain familiar skeptical challenges? At that point, one will have to become self-reflective to give answers. But it's best to think of epistemology as something done by people committed to self-reflective inquiry. We shouldn't expect all Christians to be epistemologists.
I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves just yet, but I do wonder if you look in the scriptures, do you find a sort of Christian epistemology laid out to a certain extent?
I do indeed, and that's what I've been trying to make sense of over the past 10 years or so. The epistemology found in the New Testament is suggested at by Jesus at a number of points, but you get the clearest statement of it in the writings of the Apostle Paul, particularly 1 Corinthians 1 and 2, Romans 5, Romans 8, and other parts of his writings. So there is indeed, I contend, an epistemology that is offered in the New Testament to underwrite Christian belief in God. And part of my concern has been that people doing apologetics typically don't attend to that. They look more into secular epistemologies and try to latch on to those. I'm trying to bring the discussion back to what I take to be the very vibrant, resilient epistemology found in the New Testament.
That's good, and I want to ask you more about that in a little bit, but I'll put that on the shelf for the moment and want to talk about one of your books before moving on to the main book I'm interested in. So I've read your book, The Elusive God, which is the one I'd like to explore more in a few minutes, but I want to ask you about your book, Evidence for God. Could you kind of lay out what your goal is in that book?
That book aims to look at the prominent approaches to evidence for God and to leave all of them challenged but one. So the book starts with a naturalistic approach to God, which in effect would underwrite a kind of agnosticism or atheism, and I try to challenge that naturalism with a certain self-referential problem. And that would be a challenge to many contemporary philosophers where naturalism of either an ontological or a methodological sort reigns supreme. So the opening of the book is to allow for a kind of clearing for serious attention to belief in God by challenging the prominent naturalistic approach. I also find inadequate any kind of fideism that retreats from the cognitive interests of the natural and social sciences, a retreat that seeks to free belief in God from any need for evidence. And we find that view prominent in a number of contemporary philosophers, but I find that view is actually unsatisfying. It leaves us with a kind of arbitrariness in our belief in God that in the end undermines belief in God. So I challenge fideism in one chapter and then ask whether we can pursue evidence for God in a very traditional way. That leads to the chapter on natural theology. So first of all, challenge naturalism, then challenge fideism, and then ask if natural theology will provide what we need. And we all know the familiar arguments such as first cause arguments, design arguments, the ontological argument. I offer a chapter contending that none of the familiar natural theological arguments works, that they suffer some serious defects. In particular, I argue that you can't find in a first cause argument or a design argument a case for a God worthy of worship. The book makes the point that when we use the term God, we're using a title, and that title requires worthiness of worship. But the book contends you can't get from any kind of first cause inference to a being worthy of worship, nor can you get there by any kind of inference from design or order in nature. So I find those approaches inadequate, however complex or sophisticated you make them. they aren't going to deliver what we're looking for as Christian theists. And I give a similar argument to challenge ontological arguments. But at the end of that chapter, we're left without any compelling approach to evidence for God because the arguments have serious deficiencies. I also contend that a God worthy of worship would be elusive in a certain way. That would involve bobbing and weaving toward humans where the evidence wouldn't be static. It would be more like the kind of evidence you get in personal interaction. And I contend that the natural theological arguments neglect that consideration. And that leads me in the next chapter to look for an alternative to natural theology. And I find it in a kind of personalism, Christian personalism, where we take seriously God's being a personal agent and giving a kind of evidence fitting for a God who is morally perfect and therefore a robust personal agent. I call that evidence personifying evidence. And the story is roughly this. We can find in humans a certain kind of evidence in their personal moral character that reflects or images God's moral character. And I call that personifying because we find in humans evidence for God personified in their personal moral character. Jesus ends up being a crucial figure here because he is the perfect personified evidence of God, and we image him more or less accurately, but in doing so we image God and provide personified evidence for God's existence. And then the final chapter looks at supposed defeaters for God's existence, that is, considerations that would undermine evidence for God, considerations such as evil in the world and the diversity of religious positions in the world, and I contend that those are not definitive defeaters at all.
Well, one of the things that I'm noticing there is a lot of the themes that overlap from the book, The Elusive God. You mentioned about natural theology and how none of the arguments really get us to the Christian God. But I'm imagining some apologists would say, wait a minute, we're not trying to prove the Christian God. We just want to get to a general form of theism and then take a certain amount of steps in order to get to the Christian God. I guess my question is twofold. First off, what value, if any, would you see in arguments from natural theology? And then second, would the approach typical, say, of many apologists of using, say, a cumulative case, what are your thoughts on that?
Right. Yes, that is a common approach. My problem with it is this. I use the term God as a title requiring worthiness of worship. So we're not going to get to any kind of genuine theism by first cause or design arguments. You might get a being who has a certain amount of power, but I don't see why that has to be a personal agent. I've never seen an argument showing that the first cause inference requires a personal agent. Even if it should require a first cause, I see no reason to think that cause is personal. My real problem with that two-step approach you mentioned is the complications regarding those inferences in natural theology are so serious and extensive that one rarely gets around to the crucial kind of evidence that we need to face head on. And so they end up being diversionary regarding where we need to go as Christians. And therefore, I prefer to leave them behind as any kind of case for the existence of God. At most, I think they can contribute to conceptual points about the notion of God. So if God is creator, then God is a first cause. And one can talk then about clarifying the concept of God. But that's a semantical point. It's not a point about evidence for God. So I would refrain from using those arguments as a basis for evidence for God of any kind, and I would offer them at most as providing a kind of conceptual clarification of what the notion of God involves as creator, as sustainer, and the like. And my claim is that nothing is lost by leaving them behind as a basis for evidence.
Do you think they would also have any value in maybe as a sort of confirmation or sort of contributing support to bolster the faith of someone who's already experienced God, and maybe they're having doubts, and so these arguments could also serve as sort of an added support or something of that nature?
Some people use them that way, and in fact, when I presented a version of the chapter at Princeton Seminary a short while ago, Alvin Plantinga contended that we should give them that kind of role. And I can't go there because I think the inferences involved are just too suspect. And even if you said, well, they raise the probability to some small degree, I'd prefer not to go there just because there's such a thicket of problems with those arguments, and no shrewd skeptic or agnostic will be moved by an appeal to those arguments. So I know some people think they're encouraged about God's existence when they think about those arguments. In fact, that's what Alvin Plantinga said at the session, that when he thinks about them late at night, this seems to add some probability to his belief in God. I think that's rather a psychological point about them, that some people are psychologically encouraged by these arguments. But I claim for semantical reasons, namely these elucidate the notion of God, the God for whom they have evidence from a different front, from a much more, shall we say, existential or experiential front. So I want to leave them as conceptual elucidations at most, where they don't play any significant role in enhancing evidence.
I'm wondering how our listeners are thinking right now. Maybe they're trying to wonder just where should they pigeonhole Paul Moser as far as his apologetic methodology. Do you feel like that you fall in any of the, if you will, traditional categories of methodology when it comes to apologetics?
Well, I'm a thoroughgoing evidentialist. I'm not what used to be called presuppositionalist, where the idea is you come up with certain presuppositions and then you explain things on the basis of those presuppositions. For me, that's much too intellectualist for the New Testament apologetic epistemological approach. I find it stated quite clearly in the New Testament that God intervenes first. God intrudes in human experience, and then faith in God and corresponding knowledge of God is a response to that experiential evidence that comes from God's intrusion in human affairs, in human lives. That's where the story starts. Now, when we're dealing with skeptics, we can't simply say, oh, well, God intruded in my experience, therefore believe this. That would simply beg the question. But what we can appeal to is the kind of experience that results from God's intrusion, and then use what's called an inference to the best explanation to try to challenge skeptics and others to indicate that what we're talking about is firmly evidential and is not a leap in the dark, is not wishful thinking, At the same time, it's not abstract speculation involving the kind of questionable inferences we see in first cause arguments and design arguments. This is something much more concrete and experiential, and when we add to it the role of inference to the best explanation in rational belief, we can tell a very compelling story about why we are Christian theists and why our views are not arbitrary or otherwise irrational.
Now, I want to explore that a little bit further, but I think one of the elements that will play a role in explaining that is the element of divine hiddenness. So would you mind kind of describing what that is to our listeners?
Sure. The idea is that God is worthy of worship, and therefore God is morally perfect, and therefore God is perfectly caring and loving toward all people, including God's enemies. Now, that's a very tall order for a title, but that's who God is, and we should keep that front and center, just the way Jesus does in the Sermon on the Mount. And once we do that, we can begin to reflect on what God's purposes might be in relating to us, and correspondingly what we should expect the evidence for God to look like in light of those purposes. And so I call this purposively available evidence that corresponds to God's morally perfect character. Well, we all know, if we've ever had to deal with difficult children, that we don't always want to confront the child head on. We might want to bob and weave and use a certain amount of subtlety, a certain elusiveness to present an effective, loving challenge to the one who may resist us or at least be hesitant toward us. And that's exactly what we see throughout the whole Old Testament, up to the point where Isaiah can proclaim, "You are surely a God who hides yourself." And Jesus thanks his Father for hiding certain things from the wise and learned. Divine hiddenness is not a matter of God's not being available at all, but it's a matter of God's being elusive. Under certain conditions, God eludes humans. He provides a certain kind of distance for his presence to challenge those humans in certain ways, perhaps to let them go their own way, to see the folly of their own way relative to his. So this is a personal God, a personal agent who interacts with us personally in ways that vary regarding the transparency of God's presence. That's what I have in mind when I speak of divine elusiveness. And it's a view that's confirmed again and again throughout the Old and New Testament.
You know, when I read through the Gospels, for instance, and I look at Jesus, I see there are multiple instances where he's withholding his identity, where he's not revealing himself until the proper time, where he asks people not to say who did this or who he is, and he's purposefully hiding himself. Now, what other sort of biblical support do we find that, aside from the scripture there that you had mentioned, that would make us think that God is hidden?
Well, the Old Testament is loaded with references to God hiding his face. In fact, whole books have been written on divine hiding by Old Testament scholars, and the prophets frequently mention this absence, or let's just say experienced absence of God. God isn't truly absent. This is a matter of whether God gives us the privilege of experiencing his presence in a constant or static way. And the Old Testament's very clear that the way people behave toward God can result in God's hiding his face. And we see that summarized by Isaiah when he proclaims that surely you are a God who hides himself. We're told in the New Testament that Jesus hid himself from people at certain times. But this is not a hiding that is aimed at leaving people without God or sending them to any kind of final condemnation. It's a kind of withdrawing of the divine presence to give a kind of wake-up call to people where they say, I'm really missing something here important. God's presence isn't here. I need to take seriously my relationship with God because this doesn't seem right. I seem out of sync with God. I seem to be feeling a kind of alienation. And so people will then redouble their efforts to attend to God and God's demands in their lives. So this is for a purely caring motive of drawing people into a deeper relationship with God and preventing them from trivializing God's presence. So this is all for a redemptive purpose. And as I say, the theme is recurring throughout the Old Testament and the New.
Well, you mentioned earlier there the idea of purposefully available evidence for God. And I'm afraid I don't want our listeners to kind of run over that and not catch what you're meaning there. So can you kind of unfold that a bit and describe what that is?
Yes. There are various kinds of evidence available to us, such as the static presence of certain colors and shapes in our visual field where there's no personal interaction about them. I'm claiming that the evidence for God's existence would be different from such static evidence because God would have redemptive purposes in giving us evidence in a certain way rather than another way, or at a certain time rather than at a different time. And these divine redemptive purposes would allow us to make sense of the evidence and would guide us on where to look for the evidence. So one big point I try to make in both books is that if God is indeed perfectly loving, God would want what is morally best for us. God wouldn't want simply to entertain us with pyrotechnics or any other kind of superficial evidence. God would want us to be challenged by God's own personal moral character. And so the evidence, I claim, given God's purposes to redeem us, would be morally profound. It would challenge us at a morally deep level to be transformed toward God's perfect image and to enter into fellowship with God. What that means then is we should look for evidence for God in a place that's morally profound, in a place where God would be able to carry out the divine purposes of redemption, of reconciliation of humans into fellowship and life with God. So we begin to look in a different place for evidence for God at a much deeper level, at the kind of level that Jesus had in mind when he said it's an evil and adulterous generation that looks for a sign. There he was pointing to a kind of evidence that would be relatively trivial, that would not engage us at a level of moral transformation where we're invited into fellowship with God.
Well, a good friend of mine has an apologetics blog, and he forwarded me a comment that was left on there just today, and the comment was, why doesn't God just strike me down right now, in order to prove himself, apparently. And I'm just wondering if this is kind of what we're talking about when there are certain individuals who their goal is not reconciliation with God, but treating God as if he should be obeying the creature. Prove yourself to me, show up right now. And if he did, they still wouldn't obey him. They have no intention of following God, and so God is going to withhold his presence from them, as it were. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's a plausible point. We want to keep in mind here that we all have this resistance to increasing fellowship with God. We're all like Isaiah. If we're honest, we say, "Depart from me, Lord, I'm a man of unclean lips, worthy of this presence." The presence of God is quite overwhelming if we're honest about it, because it does call us to a profound moral challenge, and it does overturn our common desires and expectations. So we're all under this consuming fire when we get the Lord's genuine presence. It's the fire that burns unrighteousness and brings profound life with God to us. But we know that even the demons believe and shudder, and they have plenty of evidence for God's existence, but they have not entered into fellowship with God. They resist cooperation and worship of God. And so the kind of evidence they have is not the ideal kind of evidence, simply because it doesn't bring them to live as creatures of the living God. It doesn't bring them into deeper fellowship with God. And therefore, some other kind of evidence is needed to accomplish what God is out to do. And that other kind of evidence is involved in what I call filial knowledge, a kind of knowledge of God where we move toward becoming children of God, children who yield to God in worship and obedience. We should not expect God to give people evidence that is simply trivialized by them. This would be casting pearls, something that Jesus discourages in the Sermon on the Mount. So I contend that the relevant kind of evidence for God's existence is morally loaded and calls us to a moral decision. And many people will say, no, I don't want this, and they'll ignore it. And others will receive it and be transformed into life with God. So all of a sudden, our epistemology regarding God's existence becomes directly morally relevant, spiritually relevant, and completely relevant to who we are as people.
Well, in your book, one of the scriptures you point out is John 7:17, and it's particularly interesting when it comes to this topic, and it says, "If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority." And that's Jesus speaking. So how do you see this, what Jesus is saying here about someone's will being involved, how God responds to that, or if maybe I'm not using the right terminology there?
No, you are. That's, in fact, the elusive God uses that passage and that terminology to talk about volitional theism. That is a kind of epistemology of theism where human volition is crucial because God is out to move the human will, not just to get intellectual assent to God's existence, but actually to challenge the human will non-coercively, to yield to God's call, and to begin life in cooperation or fellowship with God. So that passage is crucial to the kind of approach I'm trying to develop.
You had mentioned there are two kinds of evidence, I think, authoritative evidence and then spectator evidence, and I wonder if you could kind of lay that out a little bit more thoroughly as far as the difference between the two.
Yes, that distinction is central to the account because in the case of spectator evidence, we have no challenge given to the recipient to undergo a transformation of one's will and moral character. So it's the kind of evidence you might get if you glance at the clouds overhead or Lake Michigan out the window here, and you simply take in the evidence, you may reflect on it, but it doesn't call you to any kind of renewal. It doesn't call you to anything. It just presents certain, in this case, empirical features to you, and you can reflect on them and even say a lot of things about them. But authoritative evidence comes with a call to undergo transformation. And I claim that a God worthy of worship would come to people with an authoritative call, seeking a response to that call. And that's what you see again and again in the biblical narratives about God. God intervenes in human affairs and then calls people to conformity with what God has either done or reported or commanded that people do. So authoritative evidence is existentially significant and is a call to obedience. It's a call to yielding to God as the personal agent who has intervened in our experience for our good, for our very lives.
Well, in The Elusive God, which I would recommend lots of people to read, but I would also warn them that it is, as far as terminology goes, it might be heavier for some people who aren't used to some of the philosophical terms and things like that. I remember writing in the margins my various dumbed down versions of what you were saying, and one of the statements that sort of sums it up for me in one aspect or another is simply that if we're to find God, we have to seek Him on His terms. What is your response to sort of that dumbed down version there?
Well, I like that way of putting it. I would qualify it a little. I like the part on His terms. What I want to say is, when we find ourselves seeking God, God has already intervened. See, it's important to keep in mind God always moves first. I mean, He is the Creator. He is the one who has sustained us. He does send His Spirit to woo us, to invite us. And so when we say, well, I'm going to seek God, when that happens, when we state that, God has already been working in our lives to set up the occasion for our seeking. But your point about on God's terms is crucial, because the evidence for God will conform to God's character, and that means will conform to God's terms, the terms that God sets for relating to humans. And so often, we don't like to go there. We would like some spectator evidence. We would like to treat God as just another object in the universe, as if this were just an intellectual parlor game. But the living God does not work that way. God is out to challenge us in our supposed self-sufficiency. And so when God comes with evidence, there is a profound moral challenge at hand, and that moral challenge is on God's terms. It's reflective of God's perfectly loving character that is righteous, that requires what is good of us and for us, and therefore there's an ongoing challenge for us each and every day to conform to that kind of call and the corresponding evidence.
One thing that has always been a thought on my mind is that if someone says that they're a skeptic or an agnostic and they don't believe in God, in my mind I'm thinking, well, do you want to? Would you be willing if He did? And so my thought is, if He's there and if He is who He says He is, even though that skeptic might not be sure of it, well, if that person would be willing to believe in Him, should He exist, well, why wouldn't the skeptic, the willing skeptic, so to speak, not pray or start trying to look for the evidence? Or, I'm thinking, boy, if I wasn't convinced, but I thought I'm willing to believe in God, I'm willing to serve God if He's there, then it seems like I'd be praying all the time that God would show Himself or reveal Himself. How does that sort of train of thought line up with what you're talking about in your book, The Elusive God?
Well, when there is a willing skeptic, it's only a matter of time before that person is no longer a skeptic. And it will be, of course, God's good judgment when exactly the relevant evidence is presented, and God knows better than I do when that perfect time is for a person. So this will vary from person to person as to when the evidence comes, but when the person is prepared, God will bring that person to assurance through God's Spirit, who delivers the needed evidence. The problem is most skeptics don't want God to have this kind of authoritative role in human lives. In fact, some skeptics even say, I hope God does not exist. I don't want the universe to be like that. They prefer not to have this kind of God involved in reality. And that presents a real obstacle because they are thereby refusing to become willing to yield to this God. There's a kind of authority problem that arises in many cases of skepticism. And we need to attend to that and not pretend that this is just an intellectual puzzle. There's something much deeper going on. There's a human will that resists what is the appropriate kind of evidence for God, the kind of evidence where a personal agent calls us to change our lives in very significant ways, where I can no longer hold a grudge against my enemies. I have to forgive my enemies. Indeed, I have to love them. If that's not a live option for me, I'm resisting evidence for God's perfect moral character and existence.
And do you think that God may be showing people mercy in not revealing himself more fully to them if they're already obstinate, or if they were to have more evidence, they would still remain unmoved and, in essence, kind of increase their guilt? So do you think this is sort of a case of God being merciful even to those who reject his mercy?
Indeed, in many cases it is, because if God's presence were revealed to them, this might heighten their resistance. This might increase their opposition to God. If there's a certain original antipathy to God, this might be a chance to lash out at the target directly. And so God would wait for the opportune time, would wait for a certain readiness to settle in. We see this, don't we, in the parable of the prodigal son in Luke's gospel, where the son leaves and goes to live away from the father, doesn't want to have anything to do with the father, and the father waits for the son. Notice he doesn't, in that case, run after the son. This is a case where the son doesn't want to have anything to do with the father. And so the father allows for a certain kind of distance. I think we see that in the case of God's working with people who resist him. He will give them some space, let them see that this self-sufficiency is a recipe for disaster, in the hope that they will, in fact, come home. In fact, Paul says that all creation was subjected to futility for this purpose in Romans 8:20 and following, and that God subjected it to futility in the hope that people will enter into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. So this is crucial to the New Testament picture of how God interacts with people.
Now, at this point, Paul, I'm wondering how our listeners are responding to this, and they're wondering, well, how does this apply for the task of apologetics? Or they're wondering, well, how does hiddenness play a role here? He already kind of threw out natural theology, so how does this actually go down when you're interacting with someone? Should you be trying to discern or address their will of the person they're speaking with before they delve into the evidence? Or how do you think this should change the way some people are maybe doing apologetics?
Well, first of all, we should remember that in the Jewish Christian story, ultimate reality is personal, and that doesn't mean subjective. It means it has to do with a personal agent, and you and I are made in the image of that personal agent, and so are those to whom we are to preach and teach and do apologetics. So the story is ultimately person to person, and in the case of giving a case for Christian belief, we should make sure, first of all, that we ourselves are in fellowship with God, the one whose Spirit is the power to break through confusions and other bondages to give us freedom to believe in God. We need to count on God's Spirit, and that means we should be in fellowship with God, but at the same time, we should treat the ones we're speaking to as personal agents who are also made in the image of God, and that means we should discern where they are and what their responsiveness is, especially if we're talking about an actual personal interaction instead of a massive lecture to a large body of people where you can't do that. But if we're going to discern where people are, we'll be sensitive to what their expectations are. And so often people just have confused expectations about God. They expect the evidence to be a certain way, and those expectations are misguided. We can do a lot of pollution control and a lot of ground clearing so that God's Spirit can break through and actually invite people into faith in God. And we shouldn't forget that this is not just an intellectual process. This is a process where God's Spirit ultimately reveals who God is, convicts people, and leads them into genuine faith. So it's inherently personal on a number of fronts. We should keep that front and center.
In general, what sort of advice would you want to give to people who want to defend the faith and share Christ better?
The best advice is to be in profound fellowship with the Lord. That's the best advice, because when we're in profound fellowship with Him, we can be guided by Him. And each case is going to be different. And so we need to be discerning. We need to receive that guidance from the Lord. And He will often give us the guidance we need that we couldn't have figured out beforehand. So in the typical case, there are no easy recipes. I mean, we often want a kind of cookie-cutter approach, a kind of simple recipe. But when we're dealing with persons, we typically don't have that kind of simple recipe. We need to discern what's really going on in this particular context and trust that the Lord will guide us if we're in fellowship with Him to say the right thing at the right time, always pointing people to the one they truly need and not to ourselves or to our own intellectual resources, because that's not what the power of God is about, as Paul is at pains to teach in 1 Corinthians 1 and 2. The power resides in God's Spirit and not in any fancy human speech or reasoning.
Now we've got a few more minutes here, Paul, and I wanted to ask you to talk about a book that you have coming up entitled Divine Severity and Human Expectation, which I'm wondering, what is this about? So would you mind talking a bit about your goal in this book and sort of an overview?
Right. Well, it has a couple of major themes. The first one is that it's utterly important that we get clear on the conception of God that fits a God worthy of worship. And the Old and New Testament at a number of places present God as severe in certain ways. And that's not to say God is cruel or evil, but God is rigorous. Perfect love is going to be rigorous love, or it's going to be severe love. It means business. It takes God's character seriously, and therefore it is utterly challenging. It is perfect grace, but it's also a perfect challenge to those of us who don't have God's perfect moral character. So the book spells out what exactly this severity is and how it bears on a number of prominent topics that interest philosophers and theologians. For example, how does it bear on epistemology? How does it bear on redemption? A number of chapters trying to apply the notion of divine severity in a way that illuminates who God really is. But in that connection, it takes up the second big topic of human expectations for God. I think people often reject God, or at least abstain from endorsing God's reality because of confused expectations. They expect God to be a certain way. The world doesn't show that way, and so they say, well, God doesn't exist. So I want to flush out human expectations for God that are common and suggest they're misguided, and to put in place expectations for God that are more fitting to a God worthy of worship. And in doing so, I introduce a certain kind of question. I call them expectation-evoking questions. And when we raise these questions, we're pointed to sound expectations for God. And the book develops these questions in a way that leads to what I call Christian personalism. That is, God's personal character and how we should expect it to be manifested in various contexts, not only in epistemology and philosophy, but in redemption, in the context of what faith is. And so I push the line that genuine Christian faith is actually a kind of struggle to receive grace, and it's a rigorous struggle. It involves a self-commitment of the whole person, where we're challenged to undergo transformation. So faith then is no mere intellectual process. It takes us to a challenge involving our whole person.
Well, excellent. It's been very fascinating, and if this upcoming book is anything like it, then I'm sure it's a worthy read, so we'll be looking forward to it. Thanks again for joining me today, Paul. It's been a pleasure.
Good. Thank you, Brian. I appreciate it, and God bless you.
I've been speaking with Dr. Paul Moser, professor and chair of philosophy at Loyola University Chicago. Links to his books, as well as other resources, can be found at today's blog post at Apologetics315. If you have enjoyed this interview, please share it with a friend via Facebook or Twitter. If you haven't become a friend of Apologetics315 on Facebook, why not head over to facebook.com/Apologetics315 and become a fan. You can follow on Twitter at twitter.com/Apologetics315, and be sure to subscribe to the Apologetics315 interviews in iTunes. Podcast episodes are released weekly, one day in advance of their blog posting. This is Brian Oughton of Apologetics315, and thanks for listening.